Good morning. This is my first attempt at at one of these recordings, so we'll see how this goes. I don't know what you can see. I assume you can see the first slide of the Magruder's American Government Principles of Government, and that's what I was hoping to accomplish for you today. So, let's see how this bad boy works. I hope you're enjoying your time at home. Ultimately, the topic is going to be, what is government? So for those of you that had me as freshmen, or Mr. Foley as freshman, you may recognize some elements of this slide deck. However, it's been a few years, so it's really just a good start, refresher, so to speak, on government. So let's get through it. This definition of government is as basic as it can be. So I would assume, or I would think, that you would want to at least have in your mind a definition of what government is. So an institution through which society makes and enforces its public policies. Inherent in this definition is that you know what public policies are. Oh, it's got all the bells and whistles too. Oh boy. So public policies are what the government does, right? So they're pursuits. So these are just some examples of public policies, of which there are hundreds, not thousands, more examples. So keep that in mind, that this is just a snippet, if you will, of what the government should be doing. Now, remember, there's going to be levels of government that we may or may not talk about in world affairs. More than likely, we'll talk about in American government. All right. The old characteristics of a state. So historically, this has been my comparison of a state with a capital S to a state with a lowercase s. So a state, in my opinion, with a capital S would contain all four of these characteristics: population, territory, sovereignty, and government. So if we compare, for instance, there are 200 and some states throughout the world, and most times we refer to them as countries or nations. But they have all four of these characteristics. They have a defined territory, population, a set government, and then they have sovereignty. Sovereignty is kind of the key to the capital S state. Every state that is sovereign has absolute power within its territory. So if we think of the United States state as, for instance, Wisconsin, that would be a lowercase state, because ultimately Wisconsin doesn't have absolute power within its territory, because it shares power with the federal government, and therefore doesn't have ultimate sovereignty. So I would just call it a lowercase state, or a lower level, a local level of government. But it's not a state with a capital S, because it doesn't have ultimate sovereignty within its borders. So of the 200 and some states that exist at any particular day, many have some lower level of government or local government within it. The United States just happens to call its local governments states. The United Arab Emirates calls its local form of governments emirates. The Canadians call their local form of governments provinces. So there are different levels. We just happen to call it a state. So it's not a state with a capital S, but a state with a lowercase s. And I will try not to get too deep into the weeds, as I almost did with defining state. All right. I know some of you had Mr. Owen for a fifth grade teacher. I know some of you had, I believe, Mr. McGee 8th grade or 7th grade civics. And if I'm not mistaken, some of you had to memorize the preamble to the Constitution. So all I want you to do is at least look over the preamble and try to understand the main components that our framers or founders are saying are essential for a government, the main purposes of government. So, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Now, there's a lot of vocabulary in there that a lot of us take for granted. For example, establishing justice, defining justice. Now, you can go to dictionary.com or use one of your apps and get a basic definition of justice, just as you can for liberty. And I would implore you to do so, because many Americans can throw them out there as these are values, American values. These are words that describe American values, but they can't define them. So justice and liberty are difficult to define. So do your best and think about that. Also, I would say on a midterm type or a quiz type, I may ask about a section of the preamble that is important to you. So look through there for future purposes and see if something resonates with you about the preamble. What's important to you, or what do you think is important wording within the preamble? All right, how to classify these governments. As we look around the 200 and some states that are out there, we can compare. We have ways of comparison. So who can participate, the geographic distribution of power, and the relationship between the lawmakers and the executives, or the executive branch, I guess, of the government. Now we're going to go through all three of these. And again, you, for testing purposes, future testing purposes, should have a relative grasp on these concepts. All right, who can participate? If we look at governments around the world, states around the world, we can kind of compare participation, and we can classify them into democracies or dictatorships. On the democracy side of the house, you will see two different types: direct democracy, indirect democracy. Direct democracy you don't see very often. Sometimes at the very local levels, village levels, town levels of government, you may see direct democracy, one person, one vote. You show up, you cast your ballot, and it becomes rule or law or policy, and that's how that works. Indirect is, of course, what we use in the United States, where you select or elect those to represent you in the government to speak on behalf of you. So direct democracy you don't see very often. The Greek city-states. Indirect democracy you see quite a bit, and that is our style of government. Dictatorship. Again, if we're talking about who can participate within the state, dictatorship, and this is a great definition, exists for those who rule cannot be held responsible to the will of the people. So they pretty much can dictate without being held responsible. Of which we can qualify into two different categories: an autocrat, or a single dictator, and an oligarch, or an oligarchy, where a small group, usually of what the Russians would call, or the Soviets would call, the vanguard, this small elite force that's going to lead the revolution. And today in Russia, the super wealthy are referred to as the oligarchs, and the oligarchs basically are in cahoots with Putin as far as ruling that country. But as far as the citizens, not a very large voice. Right, the autocrat, or in this case Putin, pretty much dictates what's going to happen within that country. All right, we can also compare governments by the distribution of power. And these, again, hopefully you recognize from days gone by, but if not, you need to know these three. Unitary system is the most popular or utilized system of power structure in the world, the unitary government, where a single agency or single central government basically has all the power. So the British have a parliament. We'll get to parliament, but their government, located in London, has all the power, all the political power, and it controls the United Kingdom of Great Britain through its structure. If it wants to, it can share that power at local levels. If it chooses to, they can delineate some of their power down to the local levels. They don't have to, but they can. Again, the most utilized system of power in the world. Our model is the federal government. So we have a central agency or central government called the federal government that is in Washington, D.C. And our federal government, in a federal system, shares its power or divides its power between a central government and local governments. Our local governments just happen to be called states. So in our federal system of sharing power, the federal central government shares its power with the local state governments. All right, and this is a not as popular method around the world. When the United States was breaking away from the British and creating their constitution and their new government, they didn't want to be like the British. So we didn't follow the unitary model. We went to a different system. And then you have your Confederate model. Again, we're talking about where's the power. The Confederate model kind of flips the federal system. You have an alliance, basically. So if we think of the Confederate States of America, they broke away from the United States, but all of the power was concentrated in the states. They did share power. There was a central government in the Confederacy in Richmond, Virginia, and the president, the name of Jefferson Davis. But Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, was very weak as far as governmental power is concerned. All the states had the power. That's the Confederate model. If Jefferson Davis wanted to raise an army, he would have to ask permission from the states. And the states, if they wanted to, could, but didn't have to. And that government, the central government, didn't really have the teeth to enforce compliance in that case. So confederations, don't see them very often, has rarely, if ever, been successful as a model. The United Arab Emirates is pretty close. The European Union is almost a Confederate type model. So as far as a state is concerned, you don't see it very often. And then the last way that we can compare the governments of states with a capital S is the relationship between the legislative and executive branches. So the lawmakers. Every government has some version of a lawmaking body, and then an executive, whatever the executive is called. So throughout the world, there's two primary, now these aren't the only, but these are the two primary models. So the presidential model, which is what we participate in. Voters elect the legislator, the lawmaking body, and the chief executive, whatever you want to call the chief executive, who is part of the executive branch. The key to this, of course, is that the legislature and executive are independent of each other and co-equal. So that's our model. Our voters, which we just did a couple days ago, choose the legislative branch. So on Tuesday, all of the House, all 435 members of the House of Representatives were up for re-election of the legislative branch, and a third of the Senate was up for re-election on Tuesday. Also on the ballot Tuesday was the chief executive, in our case called the president, and the president is chosen separately. Once the president is determined, then the president kind of fills his cabinet positions in the executive branch. All right, that is our model, the president's model. Ours happens to be called a president. Sometimes they have other titles for the chief executives. But in a presidential system, more than likely it's going to be called president. The parliamentary system, and this is the most utilized system in the world, is voters elect the legislature, and then the chief executive is chosen from that legislative body. The way it normally works is most countries around the world, mostly European countries, have several, if not dozens, of political parties. So whatever political party becomes the majority after the voters vote, normally that's where they're going to draw the chief executive out of that majority party. Now there will be a vote, so they do have to be voted, and then they become the chief executive. Now, in the presidential system, there's only a couple of different ways you can remove a president formally. You can impeach them, or you vote them out of office. So impeachment and conviction, of course, are one way to remove the chief executive in the presidential model. In the parliamentary model, the legislative branch can vote. If they lose confidence in the chief executive, they can have a vote of no confidence and remove that chief executive. Elections, when they take place, sometimes change the majority. And if they change the majority, then they may change the chief executive. They don't have to, but they could if the majority party flips. So there's a couple of different options as in the parliamentary model. Just remember, parliamentary is the most widely used model. And again, we Americans chose a different model because we did not want to be like the British. So this is just a little breakdown. It shows you some of the countries out there, some of the states out there, and a way to compare their government with our government. All right. I tried to keep it somewhat short and sweet. You can use this video at any time if you have, or recording at any time if you have trouble sleeping at night. Just let me know if you want me to read, I don't know, like the dictionary or something like that to help you out if you're having problems sleeping at night. Thank you for your participation. See you guys.